Hello and welcome to Comic Boom, the comics and education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice, and hopefully shine some light on titles you can bring into your libraries, classrooms and onto your bookshelves at home too. This episode of Comic Boom is sponsored by ALCS, the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. Hello everyone and welcome to the final episode of this season of Comic Boom, episode 10 of season 5. Absolutely delighted to be able to bring you a top-notch guest, as always, for the podcast today. Today in this episode, which is another one of our episodes partnered with Lakes International Comics Art Festival, I am delighted to be able to bring you the Comics Laureate of the UK, Bobby Joseph. Bobby Joseph is an acclaimed South London comics creator whose work has often challenged and inspired its readers. His early work includes the creation of cult comic classic Skank magazine, where his best-known strip, Scotland Yardie, featured, and that character was later taken and then created into a graphic novel of the same name, published by Knockabout Press. He has written for The Guardian newspaper, for Dazed and Confused and Vice.com. His comic work was a prominent feature at Anarchy in the UK Comic Exhibition in the British Library in 2015 and was seen by over 60,000 visitors. And I actually spent time this week with Bobby at the British Library. I'll talk more about that later. Since the beginning of his career, he's been a vocal advocate for diversity and representation in comic books. His graphic novel Scotland Yardie was published in 2017 and was the first ever diverse graphic novel to be studied in a module on an English Literature MA course at King's College London. He's the first person of colour to become Comics Laureate for the UK. And he is a great, great guy. Not only did I have the pleasure of interviewing Bobby for this podcast, but also spending a couple of days with him this week at the National Literacy Trust's Inclusive Libraries Conference, which there was an event in Leeds and then again at the British Library in London. And absolutely fascinating to hear Bobby talk there and in this podcast episode about the importance of diversity, about the things that he noticed as a young reader and about how that's influenced both his work as a creator and his work as Comics Laureate. It's really inspiring. Bobby's a really passionate person, full of enthusiasm, and get on really well with him. He's a very funny guy as well. So I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. Here's what Bobby had to say. Hello, Bobby. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hello, Comic Boom. How are you today?
Comic Boom is good, thank you. How are you today?
Is that your first name or your surname?
It's just a single name that I go by. Welcome. I always like to start the podcast in the same way, which is asking guests to tell us a little bit about their journey as a comics reader to begin with. Where did that all start for you? When did you first become aware of comics and start reading them?
My journey begins in the late 70s, where I was taken to the cinema to see Superman, the movie.
Brilliant.
So for me, when I saw Superman fly across the screen, I believed a man could fly. And the colors, it just kind of stuck with me. And then we had Batman, because back in the 70s, going into the 80s, we had the Adam West Batman TV show as well. So that brought in another kind of colourful character that kind of appealed to me. And then from then, it translated into comic books. So for me, I saw stuff like The Flash, Green Lantern, and my journey just went from film and TV straight into comics. And then what happened with the actual comics itself, it helped me not only become a better reader, but it helped my literacy skills as well. So it helped me in all kinds of ways, I guess. So just looking at kind of comics, I became just obsessed with comics, really obsessed with comics.
So it became a real fandom kind of thing for you. Did it become a part of your personality, I guess is what I'm asking?
Interesting enough, my son said, he's a grown adult now, he said to me about a week ago, he says, Dad, you are now comics. I just kind of take a pause on that. I mean, what do you mean? He goes, Dad, you embody everything there is. You are so enthusiastic about comics. You are comics. You are a walking, talking billboard for comics. And
I love that.
Yeah, so I thought that was quite sweet. So just going back to my journey with comics. So once I realized that there was comics out there, there were some that were more accessible for me to read. So I started off with DC. So there was a lot of DC stuff to begin with. Then slowly I moved into the whole Marvel stuff, and the storylines and the artwork and the construction of the stories. It really kind of triggered things in my head with regards to the way stories are being told. I mean, I wouldn't have realized it at that age, but the fact that I was looking at stories and going, oh, wow, I wonder what would happen next. What if, say, Cyclops got into a ruck with Wolverine? What would happen then? And then just kind of like start creating,
thinking through your own stories, your own sort of spin-off narratives.
Stories. Yeah, so that was kind of the thing that I was doing.
Did you make comics at that point? Or was it solely in the reading kind of space for you? Or as a child, did you start to make your own comics?
I was always making comics. I'll give you an example, actually. I remember one when I was ill and I was at home, and two things I remember. I remember one thing was that because I was ill, my mum had bought me a copy of All-Star Squadron, which was like a Roy Thomas comic. And that's always kind of stuck in my mind because it had Robot Man on the front cover saying, I'm not guilty, because he was going to prison for something or another. And I remember watching something called The Hardy Boys, which was like a American serial program. And what happened was there was one episode where they were doing this episode about voodoo dolls. And I really liked the idea of voodoo dolls. I thought, well, that'd be a great comic strip. And I remember in primary school just drawing this voodoo doll kind of story. Obviously, it's I lost it many, many years ago. Probably the day after I'd finished it. So I was always in love with stories and how stories were constructed, and I think comics gave me that. So as I progressed reading comics, I got into stuff like Teen Titans, X-Men. Just trying to remember what I got into. Fantastic Four, Spider-Man. They were kind of like, there was Marvel Tales, which was like a reprint of the early Steve Ditko and Stan Lee stories. So I was just soaking up so many comics. And then I guess what changed for me was, when I was looking at these comics, I noticed a certain thing. And that certain thing was, even though I'm an Asian guy brought up in South London, so I'm surrounded, my community, my area, Lewisham, back in those times were Black and Asians. Yeah. So, that was my community there, right? But when I was looking at comics, I couldn't really see people of color. So, and this is from an early age.
Yeah, I was going to say, you were really conscious of that right from that early age. Yeah.
So for me, when I was, I think, when was it? Probably about 86, 87, I became really conscious of it. It's like, well, wait a minute, what's going on? So I started to collect comics with people of color in it. So because I just thought, okay, where are the people of color?
Yeah.
And then I was reading stuff like, first of all, you got stuff like Black Lightning, Black Panther, Black Goliath. And one of the things that was the first thing that kind of stood out for me was, why are all these titles having the prefix of having the word black in front of it?
Yeah.
We know Black Panther as Black Panther, but isn't a panther black?
Yeah, very true, very true.
So and these are the things I'm thinking of as a kid, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. And then I started reading these narratives, and they all seem to follow a similar pattern. So, for example, who do I look at? Luke Cage, Power Man, right? So his origin story is that when we first meet Luke Cage, he's in prison. I'm like, okay. So he's in prison. This is how he starts. So they give him a kind of injection, which is like the super serum, which is similar to Steve Rogers. And then he breaks out of prison. I'm like, okay, that's his beginning. Then I looked at stuff like the Falcon from Captain America. And even though like Captain America, the Falcon is now the new Captain America in the movies, his origin story was that he was a drug dealing pimp. So he was a hustler in Harlem. And they both had this kind of jive talk language that could only be taken from blaxploitation movies. And I was like, okay. And then I think, what was it? Cyborg from DC's Teen Titans. And I looked at Cyborg. I was like, well, this is a guy from his origin story. He's a middle-class child. Parents are both scientists. They're actually advanced in their science and, they live a very well-off life. However, when he decides that he wants to become a football player, what happens is his parents go against that idea. So he decides he's going to go to the hood and join gang.
We're seeing quite limited narratives and a lot of kind of cliched representation, and that was all that there was there. Yeah,
so looking at it from that perspective, even when I was looking at kind of like Indian characters, back then there were no Asian kind of representation. The only kind of Indian characters we have were these really passive kind of American Indian type characters. I mean, I was young. I didn't really understand. When I thought Indian, I thought it was from, South, from India itself, not the American.
Yeah.
But the characters were very passive. They're very peaceful. And I thought, this doesn't feel right to me.
We've had Meher Shibli, who was an academic who was writing a PhD on the representation of Muslim women in comics. She came on in the first season of Comic Boom and very much identified the same thing, kind of really limited character types that would be represented, and quite often either victim or, in the case of Muslim women, it was either passive or victim kind of narratives. So it sounds like this is the exact same kind of, it's these character tropes, isn't it? This really limited range of characters.
So I narrowed it down to three things. So for a while, I narrowed it down to about three tropes. One, sports narrative. So you had kind of people of color that are in sports. Two, you either had the slave narrative, where it was talking about slavery, or three, the gang narrative. So these were the three narratives that were presented as representation of people of color. So for me, as I said, I grew up in a community of Black people from the Caribbean, Asian people. So I grew up with a very tight-knit community in South London. So people I knew weren't drug dealers. Yeah. They weren't pimps. They weren't hustlers. They went off to work. They were nurses. There were social workers. There were doctors. There were teachers. They worked in shops. They went to college. People that so for me, I could see the disparity there. And so when did it kind of change for me? It was about probably 1986, 87 when the influx of comics changed, where comics personally changed, because we had, I think one of the things that was quite revolutionary for me was, and it's probably one of the few bonding moments that me and my father had, because when I was young, my father used to be a security guard in Borders Bookshop down in Oxford Street. And what he did one time was like, he took a book from the shop, he borrowed a book, which I don't think he should have done in hindsight, right? And it was Mouse by Art Spiegelman.
Yeah.
That just blew me away. And then from there, I managed to find a more kind of an indie vibe and saw stuff like Love and Rockets, which I started back back in 87, and I adore to this day. So Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez's work is just phenomenal. These works were not only representative of culture, but it showed a life I didn't know, people I didn't know. So all these kind of things come flying at me at a certain point. And my ideas of comics changed, that people of color can actually create their own narratives.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So that because there's two elements, isn't there? That they're linked, but they are different. There's a character representation, and then there's also the diversity of creators themselves, and being able to support a diverse range of creators to be able to tell their own narratives, and that in itself does diversify the characters, but it's also a different thing.
So just to kind of clarify this for me, I don't have a problem with, say, a white comic creator writing about people of color. However, if your experience of a culture is the box set of Roots, is the first couple series of Top Boy, then we have a problem. Yeah. And for so long, the narrative of people of color have been created by people that look at films. Example would be a lot of the kind of 70s kind of movies, like the blaxploitation type of movies. A lot of that language was lifted and used as part of dialogue.
You get a stereotypical representation that then other people are using as the inspiration for their own characters, and it gets just further and further exacerbated it becomes very limited. Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you came, because lots of people when they're younger love reading comics, but how did that love of comics end up with you being comics personified? How did you become to have a career in comics? Because there must have been a lack of role models or ways into the industry at that time. How did you find your way?
Weirdly enough, I found a way, because first of all, when looking at the UK publishing scene back in the early 90s, we had stuff like Deadline, we had stuff like 2000 AD, a lot of them kind of IPC type titles. That the stuff that was done was not stuff that appealed to me to write, so my thing was I wanted to write about people I knew and people I grew up with. That part of London is not shown, and that always kind of bugged me. So I would say how I got in is not by comics. It was actually by a completely alternative route. So I didn't have a traditional way of getting into comics. I was in college and then started doing a fine arts course, and then I had met a book publisher called Dotson Adebayo, who owned the Express Books, which were probably one of the first black publishing houses in the UK back in the early 90s. So they did books like Yardie, Baby Flower. Weirdly enough, Dotson lived down the road from me, and a friend knew him and introduced me to him. And then we sat down, and he really liked the kind of strange urban street type of cartooning I was doing at that time. So my thing was like, oh, okay, you like it? Cool. My thing was maybe I could get to actually illustrate one of these book covers or something like that. Or,
so you didn't have, you had smaller ambitions at that time, but just to try and get your foot in the door.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my head was like, I would do something, and then next thing you know, I'd get picked up by Marvel, and then I'm doing my own kind of mad version of the Punisher. So Dawson, what he did was like he saw what I did. It was like, look, if you are willing, what we could do is that we could create a black Viz. And I was like, what's Viz? I didn't know what Viz was. And then I read Viz and I was like, okay, I don't want to do that. That's no disrespect to the Viz guys, because I get on really well with them. They're absolutely lovely guys. But at that point, I was like, no, I want to do kind of street kind of comic strips that basically me and my friends can laugh at.
Yeah.
Right? So that was my mentality. I wanted to show Lewisham, I wanted to show Peckham, I wanted to show the kind of areas that I kind of grew up in. So the way it worked was I gave Dotton a black viz, but through my filter, which wasn't really a black viz at all. So I kind of deviated from his plan, but luckily that worked. So, and what I did was I wanted to get some art creators that really hadn't had the spotlight on them. And I just went and found also creators that were from art colleges and,
up and coming, kind of fresh
artists that I found from around the way, a graffiti artist and,
very cool.
That I knew. So we became this weird art collective. And then next thing you know, we're putting out this magazine and, it's just something that just snowballed. And then I'm now doing this magazine called Skank, which helped a lot of people of color get a spotlight, which they previously wouldn't have got. So that was how I got into comics. So from the beginning, there were no ways for me to get in a person. Not just a person, but just as a creator, there was not a way to get in. And also, there weren't platforms that I wanted to work on, simply because these platforms didn't appeal to the kind of stuff that I wanted to create. You
wanted to find almost like a space for it. It seems like a space for a new voice, a new way of talking in comics. It's amazing that you managed to do that. And it like when I speak to people about their careers, for the number of different people that I've interviewed, there's as many different ways that they've got into it. There doesn't seem to be a clear pathway, and so much of it does seem to be luck and people that you meet by chance and opportunities that come up.
Yeah,
it must be really difficult, especially if you're in an underrepresented group in the industry. It must be really hard to find ways in.
Yeah, totally. It's a lot easier now because we have social media, we have the web. So it's a lot more easier now because you can nowadays create your own comic, get it printed up like a small run of comics, and then go off and sell them. So you don't have to have large overheads when it comes to printing. So nowadays the market has changed in such a way where different ways in are being presented to comic creators. But back then, we didn't have the internet. I didn't have any contacts in the comic industry. I would go to one convention and I just thought that was a horrible experience because I was just there just as a fan. But when I was watching people coming up to certain comic creators and seeing how much gatekeeping there is in comics, it was just like, wow. I can't believe that. It's just like, wow. So yeah, I've seen quite a bit, and it was like, okay, I don't need to be part of that. So I'm just going to go create something else.
Yeah, and it was an amazing success. So from the work in Skank, that then did that translated or that progressed into your graphic novel Scotland Yardie. Was that am I right that there was part of that story was serialized in Skank, or is that
serialized in Skank?
Okay. Sorry.
No. That's my mistake because that's been put on the internet and I haven't bothered to correct.
So you can set the record straight now.
It's a completely original story. Well, maybe there used to be like one-off tales in Scotland Yardie, but it wasn't kind of collected in the book.
Okay.
I basically pulled the character apart for the graphic novel, and because when I was doing the graphic novel, I wanted to do something that was different than what was that was actually out there on the comics market at that point.
Could you give listeners a little bit of a rundown of what the story, the premise is?
Okay, basically Scotland Yardie is a Jamaican policeman who comes over to the UK simply because the UK policing at that point in time had problems on recruiting people of colour to the Metropolitan Police. So in order to get people to join the police, they went over to Jamaica and got a cop to come over and be this kind of representation of colour in the streets of London. But unbeknown to the police, this is not your average cop. So it's in essence, he's very much every single crazy cop rolled into one. He's Dirty Harry, he's Judge Dredd. So he's all this in one. So he was more a kind of spoof of all of those kind of tough guy cop tropes. And it was that conflict of UK sensibilities and that Jamaican kind of full-on attitude when it comes to policing. So it was a culture clash. It was a look at the Black Lives Matters movement, institutionalized racism, police brutality, things that were quite prominent, are still quite prominent in regards to policing. And interesting enough, it also dealt with the effects of Brexit as well, which was an interesting fact for me because I had to pull the book a couple times from the printer because in a space of about 12 weeks, the UK went crazy with regards to politics. We voted for Brexit, and my book was a satire. So if I didn't have anything about that, then
something so seismic.
And these were seismic shifts because not only did we vote out the EU, but also Cameron quit as well. So two seismic shifts in a space of about 6 weeks, wasn't it? Yeah. And then we had a new prime minister, and it was just like, well, wait a minute, and I had to pull the book a couple of times to rewrite bits and send it back out to the publisher. So it was a book that looked at a lot of what was going on, the pressure cooker of the UK back in 2015, 2016. So it was just looking at all those aspects that, we were dealing with back then. It was a experiment doing the graphic novel because Scotland Yardie was a character that was a very one-note character for me. So to create a whole graphic novel around just a caricature wasn't enough for me. So I built a lot of tension with the partner, PC Aki Saltfish, who I think the story is really about him overcoming, his anxieties and also being able to cut loose, because Scotland Yardie is the guy that cuts loose. I guess there's two sides of us. The side of us that is repressed, and then there's the other side of us that wants to cut loose. So Yardie's the one that cuts loose, while Aki Saltfish is the one that's like, no, we have rules. We must abide by the rules. And a constant battle between those two rules in everyone.
I was just thinking that it's like the little, like the angel and the devil on the shoulder kind of thing, isn't it? Yeah,
so I split those up into characters. And that's what it was. So it was a graphic novel, and that I'm happy with because there were a couple of things that I had in my mind when doing Scotland Yardie. One, there would be no sequel. Two,
interesting.
Because we'll get back to it. You can answer on that one. Two, it's one I've turned down for TV and film and animation as well, right? And is there free? Yeah, there's no merchandise on it as yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, tell me about those choices. What motivates those decisions?
Okay, the first one was that I won't do a sequel, simply because, for me, everything that is Scotland Yardie is in that graphic novel. To me, it's almost the perfect story of me doing that story. Right. So even to the point where I don't know if you've read it. Have you read it?
I ordered it before this interview, and it has not arrived. I am going to though. I will do my review at the end when I do the outro to the episode. I usually recommend a book, so I will do my review of it when it's arrived.
What was I saying? Yes. So basically, I'm happy with that book. I feel that if I did a sequel, then I think that, and when you read it, I think you'd probably understand it, that what it does is, if I'm doing the same thing again, it just repeats what I'm doing.
Yeah,
and because what's different about Scotland Yardie is that it can be read three ways, right? First way is the narrative, the kind of spoof on Breaking Bad, because there's a huge spoof of Breaking Bad in it. So it's a very straightforward narrative. Second thing is, what I've done with the story is that in every single panel, there is another gag. There's at least, in the book, there is at least 300 odd gags in the actual graphic novel in the background. So example would be, you have the David Tennant character from Broadchurch arresting the David Tennant doctor. So you've got a variety of different kind of spoofs and cameos in the background.
Yeah.
Right? So loads of gags, like, you might see Prince riding his bike in Brixton. So there's loads of kind of things that I put in there. Lots of kind of like visual kind of gags, movie gags. One that I think is quite amusing that I still like. Like, there's a movie called Boys in the Hood. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No.
Right. There's a scene where one of the characters gets killed and he's called Ricky. Right. So in the background, in one of the parts of the story, the bad guy tries to kill Scotland Yardie, and then the bullet bounces off and kills this guy called Ricky. But then you have Bianca from EastEnders coming running out, screaming Ricky.
Oh, layers upon layers. I feel like 50% of things going to go over my head because I haven't watched the right films. This is what I feel like.
But that's the thing. That's what makes it
everybody gets a different kind of a different thing from it. Yeah.
Yes, so you can read it one way where it's the straightforward narrative, you ignore everything in the background. Then you can read the second way where you can read all the things that are going on in the background.
Do you know what this is giving me vibes of? This is giving me vibes of the TV series Spaced, and where there's lots of different film references and stuff in the way that it's put together, and and you could be watching it with somebody and laugh at completely different things because you've come in from different references.
Perfect. That is a perfect example of what I would completely go. But also, I would also go with something like, say, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where Alan did a lot of literary kind of references in the background. I've just got popular culture.
Yeah. No, it sounds amazing. I will definitely look forward to reading it.
So that was the second thing. There was another thing as well.
Merchandise was another one.
Oh, no, TV. That was the one. TV. Now, I like every graphic novel or every kind of comic strip that I see. They tend to be optioned for a TV show or a movie. And I thought, okay, do I want that? And a part of me said, well, it'd be fun. But then the overriding part of me says, well, no, I don't want to do that at all. I've had offers. I had someone come up to me and say, look, we can turn it into like a 20-minute kind of Family Guy type program. And I was like, no, I'm not interested. I like the idea of Scotland Yardie being almost like the comic book version of Catcher in the Rye, where there is no adaptation of it because the author says no. So this will be the only graphic novel that won't be turned into something else, because if I sell it, then it no longer becomes mine. Their version could be completely different from my version.
Yeah.
And then they'll say their version is my version, because people will assume their version is my version.
It's that lack of control.
Yeah.
Especially when you've created something that, you said there is no sequel, it says everything it needs to say within that, then why retell it? If you've got something that you feel tells the story you want to tell. You'll
see that even in the book, I do an alternative ending to it as well. So there's two different endings to the book. So it's,
I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait. I know it's been included in a university syllabus as well. How did that feel?
It's been interesting because I had a kind of essay sent to me, and I'm reading through it, and I'm like, because it's not it's a master's, so it's an English master's. So I'm looking through it, and I'm like, wow, I need to Google this word. Wow, I need to Google that word. Wow, I need to Google this word. Because I'm just like, I'm being made smarter than I am. Why did you do that? Which is interesting, because the same way I would break down kind of like the motivations of Charles Dickens in the class with regard to the poor or poverty at that stage in history, it's the same way people are just breaking down my words. What is his motivation to do this? And that just kind of blows my mind, because, you know, like I said, I would go in the classroom, be teaching about Dickens or Priestley, you know, Priestley's kind of political ideas and stuff. And it's like, wait a minute, people are looking at my work and breaking that down and looking at my motivations.
And have you disagreed with it?
I agree with everything. Sound brilliant, so I'm not going to disagree with that. So I'm happy with that. Now, I don't know. To be, you know, everything for me is subjective. So, you know, if people love it and they come up with their own ideas, it makes you think, did I think of that? And then go, no. But, you know, if that's what the person feels, then that's entirely down to them. I don't feel the need to justify what I've done, you know, because I've always come from a satirical point of view, right? These are not my views. And this is where I guess people have kind of got lost with my work at times, where they feel that I'm putting across my opinion about something. And that's not the case. What I'm doing is that I'm satirizing people's opinions of certain things. So that's what I'm actually doing. So, yeah, whatever people say about the work, that's entirely their opinion, and I'm happy for that to be their opinion.
So you're not going to do a sequel, but do you think you'll work on another like long-form graphic novel again? Are you?
Oh, yeah. I'm working on about 3 or 4 at the moment.
Oh, so, what? You do multiple projects all at once?
Yeah, I like juggling projects, but also my motivation is this. I need to do something that challenges perception, because I'm always about what is perception? How do we perceive things? Why do we perceive things like this? So that I'm always looking at. It could be culture clashes. It could be political clashes. So for me, I'm always looking at what are the voices that are saying this about that. You know, I mean, not to throw politics into it, you know, but look at someone like Trump. He has a groundswell of people supporting him and you know, ready to vote for him. And you think, well, what is the motivation behind that? What is their perception of Trump? How is it that they ignore all the other stuff and focus on one thing? So I'm always kind of interested in how we interact and how we form our ideas. And that's kind of where I come from with regards to writing. It's like, how can I look at what that person says and find a way to understand them? So yeah, I'm always fascinated by the way we think as people. Comics, for me, are a perfect vehicle. So I'm not the traditional kind of author. How would I describe myself as a writer? I deconstruct a lot of things. I look at something and I deconstruct it. And I like doing that because that's where I guess my humor comes from, being able to deconstruct something and see what it is. And that's kind of where I progress as a writer. I'm always looking at what I can challenge. And when I say challenge, not only as in perception, but also what I can do as a writer.
And do you think are you bringing that approach through into the work that you're doing in your laureateship as well, in terms of challenge and deconstructing things? Do you think that there's a little bit of a through line with your approach to your laureateship work too?
With the laureateship, I mean, the original thing with the laureateship was that it's there to promote the art form. So I could quite easily go to schools and say, we love comics. You love comics. We love comics. Let's talk about comics. Right. And that's I could easily do that. And I could write out the next 2 years just doing that kind of stuff, going around. and saying, I'm the Comics Laureate. I could just live on the title of the Comics Laureate. But whenever I do something, whatever it is, be it writing, be it drawing, be it teaching, I always look at it from the aspect of that I've got to be the best that I can be at that present moment in time. If I'm the laureate, what does that mean? I'm a billboard for comics, promoting the medium. Yeah, I get that. That's fine. But what else can I do with it? And my thing was, well, okay, maybe, just maybe, you can put a spotlight on those voices that are not being heard. What can I do with the laureateship where I can help promote not only people of color, but, the LGBTQI community, and also new neurodivergent creators as well.
Yeah.
So my thing is, well, wait a minute. Think, what is it that you're going to do? How are you going to do it? And just to categorically state, I do not get paid to be a laureate. Right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah. So it's a voluntary position. So all the emails I'm sending out to libraries and all the emails I'm sending out to promote diversity and representation, that's off my own back. That's not someone else pushing for me. Yeah, luckily I've got ACE involved as well. So they thankfully decided to promote it via their connections as well.
Yeah,
so
that's really helpful.
Creates a snowball effect. And what that does is, and weird enough, it relates back to being a teacher as well, because I came to teaching late. So I was in my late 40s. COVID had happened. Right, COVID was just happening. And as I do, I tend to make the most strangest decisions at the weirdest of times. So at this time during COVID, I decided I'm going to train as a teacher. So I'd become a secondary English teacher in Chingford, a lovely school called Heathcote. And there I'm teaching English to Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, and Key Stage 5.
Did you use comics? Did comics come into your classroom practice at all?
We're going to, I will come to that. So I created a career as an English teacher, and I had, different type of pupils with different needs, because COVID hit a lot of kids. It really did. And
yeah, I was in the classroom at that point still too. So yeah, but a primary teaching.
Okay.
During the pandemic, yeah.
Yeah. So the pandemic destroyed a lot of confidence in a lot of our young people. So as it kind of died down and classrooms were getting back to them, because I was doing a lot of online teaching, which was new even for the teachers.
Yeah, no one there's no template for that. That was making it up as you go along.
Yeah, so I think that's probably where I started to flourish, was to actually do the online stuff, because, I was like, oh, okay, I'm quite happy to do this. I'm happy to be online and do this. But when the classroom kind of got back together, one of the things that I remember was I had a challenging Year 9 class, and different needs for these pupils, variety of different needs. And I remember one of the texts that I had was Macbeth. So this was Key Stage 3. And they were quite upfront with me. They're like, sir, we're going to be honest. Not feeling Macbeth. I'm like,
nothing like the brutal honesty of a class.
Yeah, no, my kids were very honest. So what I did was ask the head of department, are we able to get graphic novels of Macbeth sorted for these kids? And she was like, yeah, sure, well, let's do that. If you feel that's the best way for you to teach the ideas behind it. And then I was like, yes. So what I used to do, which I think you might find quite interesting, is that one of the kind of things I did was I would, after they've read like a scene, I would have like a photocopy of the actual pages that they've read with all the actual dialogue whited out.
Yeah.
So what they would do is they would then have to go through the actual play in Macbeth and find the words that would correlate to the actual scenes in the actual graphic novel. So they're trying to decipher the original text and placing it on the comic strip.
That's really interesting. Weirdly, again, referring to Meher Shibley's interview way back when in the first series of Comic Boom, but she had done a master's in Shakespeare studies, and then her PhD was in comics. And she was saying about how the relationship between a play, because a play, it's the words and then the image, like you start off with the script with the words and then the visuals is like how it would be on the stage. So actually it does lend itself to that comics representation. Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah, so that's the kind of stuff I would do. So, I love teaching, So it was great that as the Comics Laureate, I also come from an educational point of view because I'm a strong, firm believer that comics can help build literacy skills.
Yeah, completely agree. I know that you've created some book lists, which they're actually really nice and kind of starting points, aren't they, for public libraries and school libraries who are wanting to maybe develop their collection, build something that's got a really nice, diverse group of creators and character representation in it. Can you talk to listeners? I'm sure that we have a lot of librarians as well as teachers listening, so I'm sure they'd be really interested in this as a resource. If you could give us a little bit of an intro.
Yeah. When I create one of the things that as Comics Laureate is to promote the comics medium. So as I said, reading can be a difficult thing to do for a lot of people. And sometimes we need gateways to get to that point. So, and not only is this adults, but obviously as children are developing, they need to be able to have certain kind of aids to help them. And comics are a great visual aids because what it does is that it shows you what's going on. So as time progresses, it builds up those skills of interpreting the words in a variety of different ways. So I'm a strong believer that graphic novels help build literacy skills. And the reason, so with that in mind, I thought, okay, what can I do to not only help build literacy skills, but also help the UK comic industry as well? So I came up with a list of titles, Lavender Clouds by Bex Ollerton, a neurodivergent tale. You got Barking by Lucy Southern. You got Senen by Shanti Roy. We've got a variety of different UK comic creators that ranges from a variety of different kind of Black, Asian, neurodivergent, LGBTQ rights. So we've got a variety of different things that are in there. You got Bumble and Snug and the Shy Ghost by Mark Bradley.
Yeah. He's been on the podcast. He's a lovely guy. We love Mark.
I haven't met Mark, but I've read his book and it's a great book because the reason being is that he has this certain energy about his work which I like.
Yeah,
and it's accessible. You got stuff like Corpse Talk by Adam and Lisa, which is like a history kind of book. We got like a narrative which is like Mexican by Pedro Martin and Emma Reynolds, who's doing about climate talks. So, we've got a lot. And I hope they don't get offended by me saying it, but we've got stuff like Bunny versus Monkey, Jamie Smart, which I look at as almost like TikTok comic books because there's so much going on in everything, every kind of page. There's just so much.
It's a real visual onslaught, isn't it? It's
So I related to like scrolling on TikTok when you got a whole thing, like so many images just bombarding you. That's how I kind of look at Jamie's work, which I adore. And so, so that's why in my head, I'm like, this is almost like scrolling TikTok, but it's just so much things just bombarded at you. So I really like Jamie's work. And then you got stuff like Dogman, which works really, really well. A lot of the kind of stuff that I put in the list is geared towards, especially the younger list, is geared towards helping kids to read. So for me, it's almost like that bridgeway that helps them, and it helps build those skills. And as an English teacher, I feel like I'm satisfying my needs as an educator as well as a comic creator as well.
Yeah, and I'll put the links to those lists in the show notes as well so that people can look, because I think there's, as you say, there's great starting points for children on the children's list, but also I'm really keen on those adult titles, I think are definitely good starting points for people who maybe have not necessarily brought it into their own reading diet as well. So I think that's really cool.
You know what? One of the most amazing things for me to watch is going into Forbidden Planet, which is a comic book shop in London, or Gosh Comics, and seeing
I love Gosh Comics.
I love Gosh. They're my that if I have to say what's my shop, it's Gosh Comics.
Yeah, I love it.
So one thing I can say is look how diverse the readers are. There's everybody from every walk of life reading, buying comics, and it's amazing. And I always kind of look, because I remember back when it was like comic shops in the 90s where you had wooden floors and the comics are in the back of the shop, so you have to go through all these other kind of books just to get to the comics. So comic books changed dramatically with all the positive.
So you're coming up to a year, because it's announced at the Lakes International Comics Art Festival, isn't it, the laureateship? So you must be coming up to the sort of midway point of your laureateship. You've obviously achieved so much already, but what are your plans for the next?
Telling me that's quite interesting, because a lot of people say, you slow down, man. You're actually doing way too much. And it's like, okay, I guess am I doing too much? Have I done too much?
I mean, I wouldn't say too much, but you've hit the ground running, haven't you? So what's your plans for the sort of the second part of your laureateship?
So I'm looking at building literacy in schools, and hopefully this list, because I'm approaching libraries themselves. I really want to be able to have UK comics. When I say UK comics, I'm using graphic novels as comics. I see graphic novels as comics. So I just clarify that. So I just want to see a lot of UK talent have their graphic novels in libraries, simply because it helps build our industry. Because these books promote diversity, they promote representation, things that I didn't have as a kid. So by having books where we can recognize who we are, what kind of people we are, then it helps build society, right?
Yeah, for sure.
If we recognize ourselves in stories and graphic novels and books and TV, then it helps us as individuals, whatever position we're coming from as people. So that's how I look at it. You know, I mean, if there was more representation when I was a kid, then, for me, I guess it would have been a lot more easier to do comics. It's about how do we help the next generation? And not only with just literacy, but how do we build people up? So that's how I'm looking at the kind of laureate list, being able to help by putting diversity and representation out there, because what that does is that it encourages us to be more of who we are, and who we shouldn't be afraid of who we are, regardless of color, creed, race, gender.
100%.
Sexuality doesn't matter. Be who you want to be, and we should have books and graphic novels that represent that. And I'm a strong believer of that. So I'm carry on doing the laureate list and keep pushing it. But one of the things I really want to do is focus on prisons. There's literacy that can be promoted via graphic novels, via prisons as well. I think that's something that I really would like to focus in my second year, being able to help people in prisons.
At the end of the podcast, I always ask guests to kind of sum up a few key points or takeaways that might help educators, librarians listening, a few things that might influence their practice. From all of your experience, from both as a teacher, as a comics creator, as laureate, what would you leave listeners thinking about?
I would say that as an educator, comics are a gateway for literacy. It builds literacy skills. That as an educator, that is as an English teacher. As a comic creator, I would just say that comics are literature. Comics are art. We are comics. That's it.
I love that. There's a brilliant comic strip, and I can't remember who it's by. I'll try and find a link to it and put it in the show notes as well, where it's like two cowboys having a punch up, and one says, "I say comics are literature," and the other one says, "I say they ain't," and then they have a big punch up. And it really makes me laugh. It's great.
Yeah, comics are so many different things to so many different people, and that's the great thing about comics. And for me, comics, I've said this before on a documentary that was done on me, but I said that comics is one of my greatest loves, and that's very, very true. It's probably the longest relationship I've ever had, and that is with comics. So, yeah, I've been in love with comics since 1979. When I was a little boy. So I've been involved and in love with the whole medium of comics since 1979 in one form or another. And I'm not going to change. It's always been something that gives me joy. And I encourage people to, if you've never experienced a graphic novel, never experienced a comic, to go look at my list.
Yeah, good starting point.
Good starting point. See what it is that appeals to you. They're all great. If it's manga, we've got a lot of manga. If it's children's books, we've got some really great children's books. And then there's the UK Comic Creators List, which has got some wonderful people on it.
Yeah,
and some really good titles. I should have put mine on there, but hey, I'd rather get other people out there before I even come on anything like that.
So this might be a difficult one for you, I think. Then the final thing that we ask is, if we were to add one comic to our to be read piles tomorrow, what should it be?
To be read pile.
What would you recommend us?
I would. It depends. That's like saying the top 5 movies. What do you mean your top 5? That's like, what genre are we talking about? Top 5 sci-fi? Top 5 gangster? What do we mean?
Just one. I often hear people at this point become so overwhelmed they just look at the shelf behind them, and you can hear that they're turned around and they're just looking at their shelves.
I'm not that guy. Give me a genre, and I'll be like, okay, that's what you need to read.
I can't do that. It's supposed to be difficult.
Now that I've thrown it back on you, now you're arguing.
Okay, I'm going to give you a genre and then see how you like that. Because my favourite types of comics that I most like to read, although I do read widely, but I tend to gravitate to a kind of autobiography type comic.
Okay. Autobiographical. I do like a bit of American Splendor, Harvey Pekar, Mouse. Phenomenal. Look at Mongrel, which is a brilliant book. That's an autobiographical, brilliant book.
Yeah.
So, anything. Go on, hit me up with another genre. See? Go. Let's begin.
Okay, so I'm interested in silent comics.
Silent comic. Alpha, which is a great silent comic. That's what Knockabout.
Don't know that one.
So that's basically about it's almost like looking at how the world was formed through graphic novel medium. So that's a great book.
Thank you so much to Bobby for taking the time to talk me through all of his experience, such a wealth of experience, not only a standout comics creator, but an educator, someone who understands the way in which comics can be woven into the education space and actually been there, done that from a frontline perspective. It's really brilliant to hear. And then someone who's so passionate about advocating for the UK indie comic scene and the importance of diversity in terms of everything we do. And hopefully the people who are long-term listeners of the podcast can see through the guests that we've had on that that's also a really key concern of mine and something that I'm really keen to do through the scheduling and the people that I get onto the podcast. And as I said in that clip, now I am slightly ashamed that I didn't actually manage to read Bobby's comic before I interviewed him. Product of the summer holidays, ordered it too late, it didn't arrive in time, but it is my responsibility. Not ideal, but I am delighted to say that I have read it now. It really did make me laugh. It's really, really interesting, actually, because I kind of feel like you think of something like 2016, that kind of post-Brexit time, of being it is relatively recent history. But then when you look back on a piece that's really fixed within that time frame, you see all these cultural references that are so relevant to that era. And I really enjoyed seeing that, being able to pick out, as Bobby sort of mentioned, the things in the background, simple things that made me laugh, like sidelines from pigeons and cats and things in the background of the main story as well, which I thought were really cleverly done and very funny. I'm not a great reader of satirical stuff. It's not something that I would generally lean towards, so it's really good to stretch my reading horizons a bit and give me something a bit different to read. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Bobby, for that. Definitely one for adult readers, but I'm sure a lot of you will enjoy that, and you will have heard Bobby talk about it in depth, so I'm sure that has sparked your interest if you haven't read it yet. This is the last episode of Comic Boom for this season. It's gone so quickly. I've had an absolutely brilliant time. Thank you so much to all the guests that have come on the podcast. It has been brilliant to be able to bring you all together and celebrate your work, whether that be work in schools, whether that be illustrators, creators, whether that's academics. If you've missed some of the episodes, go back and check them out. We kicked off the season with the absolutely incredible Nick Sousanis talking about his approach of using comics in university education and his work creating his dissertation in comics form, a great thinker around comics and a really in-depth conversation. I enjoyed that. We spoke to I Hate Pixies creator James Turner. We spoke to Claire McGreevy, an educator really working closely with how space can be found within the primary curriculum and in the primary classroom, collaborating with Chris Mould there in Rochdale. Absolutely brilliant. I loved that episode. We spoke to Julian Sedgwick and Chie Kutsuwada about their work, their collaborative prose and manga books. Very, very interesting, and some really interesting conversations about writing about other cultures outside of our own experience and how important it is to have credibility in that space. We spoke to writer Swapna Reddy, or Swapna Haddo, you may know her as, all the way from New Zealand, talking to us across the airwaves about her Reggie Rabbit series, really accessible set of, again, prose and comics combined in a lovely series published by Oxford University Press. We spoke to Lida Sene in Athens about the Athens Comics Library. So much interesting things that we can learn from what's happening in other countries around comics education. And then we move into our Lakes International Comics Art Festival collaborative episodes, where we spoke to the Rickard sisters about their approach to using historical texts and recreating those in comics forms. We spoke to Molly Ray about graphic medicine and her beautiful, beautiful book Giant, which has just come out this year. In the last episode, we spoke to Isabel Greenberg about her work Young Hag and her previous works, her most recent work Young Hag. And then again, obviously in this episode, you've just listened to Bobby Joseph. What a lineup! What a brilliant lineup, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to bring you these creators. You may be familiar with their books, maybe you haven't heard them speak before, maybe you're not familiar with their books and this is your introduction to them, so it's absolutely brilliant to be able to do that. Thank you so much. And it's also been great, I spoke at the beginning of this episode about the Inclusive Libraries Conference run by the National Literacy Trust, where I spent some time with Bobby, and I also got to meet some listeners to the podcast. So hi Jenny, hi October. It was great to be able to meet you. It's always an absolute pleasure. Hopefully this weekend coming up in the Lakes International Comics Art Festival, I might be able to meet some past guests on the podcast, and hopefully some listeners there as well. Excitingly, I've got a t-shirt. I've got a t-shirt with Comic Boom on the back. I'm so excited. In fact, not just one for me, but the whole family, a little tribe of Starbuck Braidleys. Actually, they're just Braidleys, but a little tribe of Braidleys with Comic Boom t-shirts on. If you see us there, give us a shout out. We would love to see you. But thank you for tuning into the podcast, for being passionate advocates about comics in your settings, in your field. It's absolutely a delight to work on this and to have this community around using comics in education. So I've just have a brilliant time creating these podcasts and meeting people who listen. I should also thank our sponsors for this season, ALCS, the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, who have been really, really supportive of the podcast and enabled me to be able to buy the books to research the guests, pay for the hosting to be able to get the episodes onto Spotify, onto Apple Podcasts. It's absolutely brilliant to have that support from ALCS, as well as obviously the wider support that they give authors to ensure that they get money for their work being used out there in the world. So thank you so much for ALCS. We will be back in 2025 with another season of Comic Boom. Just going to have a little bit of a break and then start planning the next season and the next lineup. Thank you so much for listening. You can stay in touch over the break through Twitter at Lucy_Bradley or through Instagram on @comic_boom_podcast. My name is Lucy Starbuck Bradley. I'm the producer and host of Comic Boom. Thanks for listening.